Okay, well, I think we might get started as it's 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So thank you everyone for joining us today for this seminar from Brian Aguado here at the University of Colorado. This is a series of seminars that the PAC, the Postdoctoral Association of Colorado at Boulder, have been hosting over sort of the last year on a range of different topics, from more specialist subjects to sort of understanding yourself through this time as well. So it's great to have Brian with us today. He is the former president of PAC, so it's great to see him returning in this capacity and his future endeavors at the University of San Diego. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about Brian before we started. He has recently just won the Outstanding Postdoc Award at CU Boulder. So this is quite a timely presentation to highlight this and sort of highlight Brian as well as the postdoc that he is. It's great to work with him. I'm also a postdoc in the Anseth lab here at Colorado. So it's great to work with him, and it's really exciting to see what his future research group will hold. Now, saying that, Brian today is going to focus on his faculty journey, which took place last year. Being in the lab, I feel like me and our co-host Michael were at hand to listen to every up and down throughout this process. So it will be great to hear his tips that he has in this presentation. So with that, thank you, Brian, and I will hand it over to you.
Awesome, Laura. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much to you and Michael for the invitation. And I'm just so excited to share a little bit about my experiences on the tenure track market. And my goal today is to really try to demystify the process for all the graduate students and postdocs out in the virtual audience that might be interested in pursuing a faculty position. And this is more of a informal presentation and sharing some of the tips that I wish I knew when I was on the market, and tips that I had gathered from other folks that had shared their experiences with me. And basically I'll just kind of walk through the whole process with you. And just to begin, okay, so this is, let me see if this will work. So just to begin, I want to have a disclaimer for everybody. I have basically just one faculty cycle's worth of experience. So all the information that I'm sharing with you today is based on my personal experiences, and really my advice to you is not coming from me having sat on numerous search committees or have evaluated candidates. I'm not that kind of person. I'm more of just a candidate that went on the market and can give you some clear-cut advice. So really, I have no idea what I'm doing as in really the search committee capacities and how they view candidates, but I can at least give you some insights as to what the experience was like as a candidate. So the tenure track faculty search process took me around, let's say, 11 months worth of work. It was a really trying process, and it's really essential to have an advisor that will be supportive of you during the entire search process. So Christy, she was wonderful to me and really gave me the time that I needed to pursue this really difficult task of finding a position. So I started the process around, I'd say like May of 2019, when I was reflecting back on the process. And so I call that kind of the getting ready stage. Like you have to get mentally ready for this process. And then the second step is really finding your allies. That's kind of identifying your friends that are on the market, your recommenders, those kind of things. And we'll get into some details. And just by the way, I'm going to get into details for all of these 9 steps. So we'll cover everything. The third step is writing your materials. That took me around, I'd say, a couple of months worth of work, and I'd say full-time work. And then you're also searching for jobs and applying for jobs. And that really took basically from September to December of 2019. Also, it's really important to go to conferences. You're going to need to meet the people that are going to be evaluating your materials. So it's always really great to put a name to the face. And I went to the Biomedical Engineering Society annual meeting last year in 2019. And then around October to December, I started hearing back about remote interviews. So we'll get into some remote interview tips. Next, after passing the remote interview stage, you'll get into on-site interviews. And that usually goes from November to March of 2020. And I'll even talk about how COVID started to impact the on-site interview search. And then second visits and negotiations happened for me from February to April. And then April 2020, I assigned my position. So really, it's this just incredibly long process. And you need mentors that will support you through this process. And obviously with COVID and everything, it really just kind of jumbled everything at the end. But I really just want this also to be a conversation. So this is going to be a really informal presentation. And if anyone has questions along the way, please feel free to interject with the chat icon. And I'll try to see if folks have any questions as I move along. So what does it mean to get ready for this process? You really need to find your inner drive of why you want to be a professor. I've wanted to be a professor ever since I was an undergrad researcher, watching my mentor become an assistant professor and get tenure. And I was just, I knew I wanted to do the research. I love teaching. I love service to my community. I love mentoring. There's just so many things about this job that gives me so much enthusiasm and passion that is just something that I feel like I was meant to do. So I think you have to really find that introspective drive of like why you want to be a professor and stick to that goal, because the process is so long. And even myself questioned whether or not I even want to do this job because the process is so difficult. So it's really important to like find that inner drive and that stick-to-itiveness, and that will get you through this process. Another aspect of getting ready is networking. I cannot stress the importance of networking. And this should happen like as early as possible. I think I really started networking in graduate school when I attended my first Gordon Research Conference meetings. And networking comes in different forms, right? Like when I was a graduate student, I was networking with postdocs, maybe some assistant professors. And then as time went on, now that I'm on the market, all of those postdocs and assistant professors that I met years ago are now chairing search committees. And now they're like chairs in departments. So that long game really, I think, helped me a lot in attracting attention on the market. You also have to think about branding. Like, what do you want to be known for? What do you, like, when you are evaluated for tenure, what is that one niche of research that you want to execute and be known for that no one else has been able to accomplish? And then obviously with that branding idea comes with generating ideas. You have to start thinking about how you can align the skills that you have learned through your PhD and postdoc training with different types of questions. So those questions can be, I'm a biomedical engineer, and those questions are really biology driven for me. So my matrix of skills include like hydrogel fabrication, nanoparticles, like all sorts of different types of tools. And then I got really interested in the biological questions like sex differences and precision medicine and these kind of things. So when you start aligning your tools with your questions, and then you can identify how maybe nanoparticles can be applied in precision medicine, or how biomaterial scaffolds can be applied to study sex differences. And you can start to like generate lots and lots of ideas and really start to pick out which ones you might want to eventually be known for. And then you also want to develop your online presence. So really, I did not realize the importance of building a website. Websites are absolutely critical. Search committees go to your websites and look at who you are. That's just another element of your branding. And then also having a Twitter account is really useful, and starting to build a presence there as well. The next step is really finding your allies. My allies were first and foremost my family and friends. They will carry you through this process. Laura and Michael in my lab, they were awesome people that I could talk to while I was on the market, and They listen to all my crazy stories, and I can't thank them enough for that. But also with my family, like my family would, when I was busy at a conference, my parents live in Colorado Springs, and they drove up to help me clean my house when I was like slipping with that. So just those small things just go a long way. So you really, like, it takes a village to get a faculty position. So you really have to develop that support network. As far as colleagues are concerned, I really suggest to identify a core group of friends that are on the market with you and help each other along the way. It's absolutely critical for, let's say, developing a group of 5 to 6 friends that you know are on the market together, and you can start to curate job opportunities with each other, read your statements. Like, having that core group of friends was really important for me. And then finding your mentors. So you really need to reach out to your recommenders for letters. And this is another difficult part of the process, is making sure that your recommenders know exactly what universities you're applying to, and make sure that you guys are all in sync to get your letters submitted. And the 5 recommenders that I had my postdoc advisor, my PhD advisor, a postdoc collaborator. I did a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work in graduate school, so I had my DEI mentor. And then my undergrad advisor served as my backup letter in case there were some schools that asked for maybe 5 letters or something. So that's kind of a breakdown of my letter writers. Then the next process is writing your materials. Now, you have to really think of writing your materials as a full-time job. You're basically writing a grant for who you are going to be as a professor, with your research, your teaching, and your service. The application consists of 5 things. Generally, some departments are annoying and require other types of documents, but in general, most departments require these 5 things: a cover letter, a CV, a research statement, a teaching statement, and a diversity statement. And it's really critical to be original in all your documents. And we'll get more into this and what I mean by that. But when search committees are reviewing 300 to 400 applications, it's critical that the documents that you provide to them stand out among the rest. And there's lots of ways to do that. And you want to just look as good as you can on paper to really set yourself apart from all of those candidates. And I made sure to reach out to lots of assistant faculty that had just gone on the market, and I asked for examples of their statements if they were willing to share them with me. And please feel free, if you're interested in my documents, please feel free to reach out to me. But I realized that could be a tricky situation where some people might not be willing to share documents because some of those ideas are how they're going to start a lab. So I kind of see it as this, like, a research statement is more about pitching just who you are as a researcher and not so much about projects, but we'll get into that. So the cover letter is 1 page. Please keep it at 1 page. I've seen some examples where it's 2 pages or even longer than that, and it just becomes not effective at that point. Your cover letter, I broke it down into 5 paragraphs. So your first paragraph is really name dropping. You want to state the job that you're applying for and list your advisors, departments, and institutions. It's a really simple paragraph to write. And express your enthusiasm for applying to the position. Then the second paragraph is your research program pitch. What is your lab going to do? And potentially mention any funding you might have on hand or any previous funding that you have received to support these kind of projects. Your third paragraph might include something that's a summary of your previous work and how that previous work will help you achieve the research program that you're proposing in paragraph 2. And then paragraph 3 is kind of an opportunity to mention some of your most critical papers that you've published during your PhD and your postdoc. Paragraph 4 is thinking about accomplishments outside of the lab and what really is going to make you a good PI and leader in your field. So these are all the extracurricular activities, your teaching, your service, your outreach, any leadership courses you've taken, some business classes, lots of different opportunities for you to showcase how you think you're going to be a good PI and contribute to the university community, not just with research. And then paragraph 5 is basically just a summary of why you think you are a good candidate for a position. And thank you for your consideration. The CV, I know this talk is going to be recorded, so I'm not going to say all of these things, but these are elements that I included in my CV and the way, and basically in the order that I organized them in. And you generally want to highlight your publications and grants at first, and then kind of just go in order with different types of teaching, mentoring, and diversity and inclusion and whatnot at the end. Not to suggest that that's not important, but that's kind of the order that, that search committees like to review things. So what does the research statement consist of? Your first half of your document should really be communicating your long-term vision and your short-term vision. Your long-term vision is, what do you want to do in your 30+ year career as a professor? It's a really daunting question, but that's ultimately what they're hiring you to do. They want to hire candidates that will get tenure and transform their department. So they're hiring you for this 30-year long position. And I mean, obviously you're probably going to move, you're probably going to do different things, but that's ultimately what they want to hire you to do. And then you want to think more short term. Like, what is your short-term vision? And what do you want to be known for when you're evaluated for tenure? So this should be like a digestible chunk of your long-term vision. And maybe like something like, so I'll give an example. So my long-term vision, I would love to develop biomaterials for precision medicine. And I'm very interested in developing biomaterials that can enable the evaluation of a patient's unique biology as a function of sex, age, and ancestry. That is a career-long vision. And my short-term vision, what do I want to be known for tenure? I'm very interested in studying sex differences in cardiovascular disease using precision biomaterials. So it's kind of like a small digestible chunk of that large-term vision. And I'm very interested in achieving that short-term vision. And that's what I ultimately want to be known for as a faculty member. So that's like probably the most important section of your research statement. Because if you can get your audience to read that half page and be excited, then they're going to read the rest of your research statement. Because if they are not interested in that long-term and short-term vision, then, or if your long-term and short-term vision are buried within this like super complex document, then your search committee will quickly lose interest. So this is one really great way to try to be original and really stick your goals at the like forefront of your document. Another tip that I learned that was super important is to have a figure on every page. So many professors are visual learners, and it's really important to have, let's say, one figure for your long-term vision, or your short-term vision rather, and thinking about one figure per project. So it could be, and I strongly suggest these figures are conceptual and not data-driven. There's going to be so many people on your search committee that are outside of your field, and really, they're not going to understand the data that you might be presenting to them, but they would understand conceptual experimental setups or those kind of figures. Then the rest of the document is basically pitches for your maybe 3 projects. And if they're, so I'm assuming that most of us here are in the biosciences and familiar with the NIH. If there are other postdocs out there with different types of research interests, you might think like NSF style types of project pitches. But ultimately, this is what worked for me, was thinking about 3 different projects with 2 different aims, and basically just writing a specific aims page for each of those projects, stating the clinical motivations, stating the hypotheses, stating my critical methods that I want to develop. I also buried in my previous experience. So you have to state why you are the best person for these projects, and try to stay around 1 page per project. And then at the end, so basically long-term, short-term, and projects are not customized. And I strategically did that so I wouldn't like have a huge headache in trying to customize my research statement for every single department. But I saved the last half page of my research statement to focus on funding and institutional opportunities. So this is the separate section that is customized for each department. And there I basically shared how I will fund my lab using potentially university-specific funds or external funds, and how I can think about collaborating with different peers in my department as well as different institutes at the university. So you really want to show how your research program will fill and build upon the strengths of the institution and department you're applying to. And really, the goal of this project, the goal of this statement is to stay focused on the broad impact of your work and keeping it high level. And please do not get buried into the details or the nitty-gritty of any data that you might be presenting, because search committees will quickly lose interest. The teaching statement is really about why you want to be a professor and really why you are interested in teaching. So you must have a teaching philosophy. And really, this teaching philosophy is why and how you want to teach in a university. And it's different for everybody. The key is to try to sound original. I told a personal story of how my anatomy teacher really inspired me to become a tissue engineer. If you go along some sort of personal anecdote, you will stand above the rest. Then you want to think about your teaching goals. And I suggest outlining 3 goals that you might be interested in implementing in your classroom. And each goal has an enactment and an assessment. So how will you do it? And then once you do it, how will you assess student performance? Current classes. So this is, some people say that this is the most important part of the teaching statement. Is you really want to list the courses that you would be qualified to teach and that you would be willing to teach in the department. So really go to the course catalog, highlight some courses that you'd be interested in, and copy, paste, and insert it into your document. And then at the end, you also want to pitch some proposed classes. So how will your research program potentially motivate you to design your own course? So you might think about maybe a couple classes that the department does not have that you would be interested in designing for the department. And the third major document is the diversity statement. So here for the diversity statement, I think that this will be one of the trickier documents to write for most candidates. I think this is, and I'm going to share what I did and what ended up being effective for me. And I basically just shared my story. I started with a personal anecdote of being a first-generation Colombian American. And I mean, I can get into those details. I'm not, because there's so much content here. But basically, you just want to be original and just share who you are. If you start off your diversity statement by saying something like, STEM has a diversity problem, then you're not sounding original. You want to make sure that you want to make sure your entire document is original to you. And if you just state the obvious that, oh, STEM is like academia is racist, like we all know that. But what about you and what have your experiences been in the STEM community? Right? Like you really want to focus on the kind of stories that you can bring to the table. Then you want to think about how you've managed diversity issues. Maybe how have you mentored students of diverse backgrounds? Or I personally chaired the Gordon Research Seminar in biomaterials. So I had to handle issues of ensuring that the conference was represented the diversity that is required. So there, and I basically told this personal anecdote about that experience. So they really want to evaluate how you're going to manage diversity issues as a professor. Then another portion of your diversity statement should include ideas about how you've advanced diversity. So what activities have you done to advance DEI at your institution? And then lastly, you also want to think about the future. It's really important to think about the future and how you, based on the experiences that you have done to advance DEI, how will you advance DEI at your future institution, and how will you synergize with different resources at X university and build upon the current strengths of their diversity initiatives. So once you have all of your written documents ready to go, then you want to search and apply for jobs. And this is going to happen kind of all at the same time. I had the most success searching for positions on department websites. I basically knew departments that I wanted to apply to, and I basically just kept an eye out if they had open calls. I also reached out to professors that I knew in the department to ask if they were opening a position. So getting that insider info was really important. You can also consider searching for jobs on a number of different websites that I curated here. I mostly consulted the BMES because I focused on biomedical engineering departments, and academic jobs online was really great too. But yeah, these are all really great resources to locate different types of positions that are open. But I think the most important thing is really curate jobs with your friends. Like, do not do this alone. There's so, especially nowadays with like not as many positions being announced, or maybe universities not being as public about posting positions or something like that. It's really important to start a Google spreadsheet with some of your friends that are on the market and looking at similar departments. And you can start to curate all the critical information. So for instance, in the figure I have down here, you have your university, the department, the deadline, and basically the website where you can submit the application. That's all you need to do. And it was immensely useful to do this with friends, because searching for jobs on my own would have been just completely overwhelming and impossible. But if you split the job between 5 to 6 people, then the list will just populate like it's by itself, and you will have all the links that you need to submit your materials. And this so think applying takes time. So given the customized aspects of all your documents, I basically was at steady state, maybe submitting 1 to 2 applications per day. And then that was like, again, a full-time job. Like I did not do any experiments for 9 months. So, but basically I ended up submitting around 35 applications. The question about how many jobs should I apply for? There's no right answer to this question, and everyone has different needs. I had some friends that applied to 4 positions and they got the 4 jobs. So amazing, 100% turnaround. I've heard of other people that applied to 150 jobs and got 2 interviews. So it's just like, there's just so many different ways that people go about this, and you just have to really focus on what's important to you and not focus on what other people are doing. I think that the way I ended up deciding on how many departments to apply to was I really focused on departments where I could teach effectively. So I really focused my efforts on identifying BME and BioE departments. Research-wise, it doesn't really matter what department you go into. I mean, we can talk about that. But really you want your home department to be like, where are you going to be teaching the most? And I think that I'd be most qualified to teach biomedical engineering classes, so that's why I focused my efforts in that department. I ended up submitting 35 total applications, and some of my decisions played into thinking about location. I mean, I hate winter. Like I want to live somewhere with permanent summer. Again, like I applied to places with winter because it's like you can't close doors, but you have preferences. So that can inform where you end up submitting applications. Proximity to family, partner considerations, there's so many things to think about. I generally, if it was a department that was in the top 20, I would apply, because even if it was a department that I wasn't necessarily serious about going to, it was an opportunity for me to think about, well, if I got an offer, then it could potentially be an opportunity to observe offers and leverage negotiations. And then thinking about reach, real, and safety schools. So I applied across all rankings, but really no school is safe. Like I would get positions from top 10 departments and get rejected from like schools that are ranked like 60 or 70. So it's just like, there's no rhyme or reason. People like identify candidates that they like and want and target specific candidates. So we'll get into that as well. So the importance of going to conferences can't be understated, and it's especially difficult during these times because everything is virtual. So I'll just go based on my experience and like what you can think about to prepare for these kind of scenarios. So I attended the Biomedical Engineering Society annual meeting, and they had a Meet the Faculty poster session. So basically, this is an opportunity for you to present your research program, your research teaching and diversity program, really, to search committees and search chairs. And this was a really great networking experience for me. I met a bunch of search committees and a bunch of search chairs, and all encouraging me to submit applications, those kind of things. So I would suggest, depending on your field or your society, try to look for these kind of events and participate. My poster, just to prepare, it was around a third of my lab vision and about me, a third of my previous research, and a third of my conceptual project ideas. I'm happy to share examples of my poster. The key is really to stay surface level in these presentations and really don't overwhelm with data. You're really trying to sell your vision and your brand. And ultimately, if you become this salesman, if you can clearly articulate your research and engage with your search committees, then sometimes, and I had this experience, that if I had a positive interaction with that search committee, I would just get a direct to on-site interview and I would bypass the phone interview stage. So that was kind of one of the benefits of kind of going onto these, into these kind of events. And also try to give platform talks during your meeting. Since I knew I was going on the market, I submitted 3 abstracts and got 3 platform talks. So that visibility was really great. So it's important to be visible at the conference because people do go to your talks. So once you do submit all your applications, attend the conferences, etc., then my experience was going on remote interviews. So congratulations, this is great. Like, the department is interested in you. I've understood that in general, out of 300-400 applications, typically the top 10 or top 20 are interviewed remotely. So basically here, I think that they're testing your personality and ability to show your enthusiasm for the research and your enthusiasm for the department. They'll ask you about teaching, they'll ask you about diversity, they'll ask you about your research program, how it will fit into your department. Questions about scheduling. So in my experience, you have all the power. I had 22 remote interviews. I did not schedule all of them. I had to decline a few. But my experience was that all the departments were willing to work with me to find a time that fit my schedule. Because if you say that, oh, I'm so sorry I can't attend a remote interview on that day because of another interview, then it makes you look more desirable. So the search committees will adapt to your schedule if conflicts arise. My strategy for remote interviews, I generated a library of questions and really spent time answering and rehearsing all of my answers. And I cannot understate the importance of practicing. You have to practice over Zoom, you have to practice over the phone, practice with your lab mates, and really nail down your answers for each, and really they're customized answers for each department, right? Because you have to think about, like, for example, one of the most common questions that you'll get is why your department? So you want to very quickly state your research program vision. And then I broke that question down into 3 ways. I thought department level, like I would be a good fit because I could establish these collaborations within the department. And then you would list Professor X, Professor Y, Professor Z. Then the university would be really great for me to launch my research program because of all these institutes and centers and funding opportunities. And then I really want to go to this particular location because you guys have all of these amazing institutes that are outside of the university that I could tap into. So building like inter-institution collaborations, right? So you have to think like on multiple levels how your research program will fit within that academic community. Another tip, dress professionally for these video chats. I would dress in my suit. I would even wear shoes that were formal because I thought that getting in that right mindset really like kind of elevated my my game a bit, and I felt like I was more enthusiastic when I was answering their questions. Try to dress and send thank you emails to anyone that you interacted with after your interview. And then you come to on-site interviews. That's great. At this stage, you're the top 3 to 5 candidates. And really, it ends up being your job to lose at that point. Now, I kind of disagree with that point a little bit now that I'm thinking about it, because at some of my universities, I could tell that there were, so what I think happens, I can't say this for sure, but what I think happens is that 3 to 5 candidates are interviewed for HR purposes, but then one candidate is clearly hired for the position. And I had this experience, and we can talk about this offline, but I knew of certain positions I was interviewing for, but really I knew I wasn't going to get the job because other people were favored, we'll say. So really, it's just a situation where you just kind of have to go for it and see what happens. I had 13 on-site interviews. My strategy for scheduling this, I scheduled them weekly. I had basically Monday, Tuesday to prep. I scheduled travel on Wednesday. I interviewed Thursday, Friday, and then I would come home either that Friday evening or Saturday morning. And again, I had all the power to schedule times. I would say, like, I can't attend this week, I can attend the following week. I had one department that was not flexible, which required me to actually cancel an interview with a department and fill in a slot because this particular university was my top choice. So it was like, I should probably interview with them and decline the other interview. So there are strategies to do that as well. I'm happy to share techniques with that and navigating those politics. You want to be ready to suggest names of professors or other institute directors, et cetera, that you want to meet during your visit. So you'll usually submit that list to a secretary and they will prepare the visit for you. And then interviews generally consist of one-on-one meetings with faculties. They consist of you giving a department seminar, a chalk talk, and having meals with faculty. So your one-on-one meetings, I came with basically a question and a notebook, and I basically just had like a one-page primer of questions for each faculty member I was meeting. So you'll get your schedule in advance, develop questions for each person that you're meeting with, and I would have all of that in a notebook. So in case the conversation kind of went dry, I would just glance down and look at a question. So there's no problem there. The department seminars, 5-minute vision, 10-minute of your PhD, 20-minute of your postdoc, and 10 minutes of future. That's kind of how I broke it down. My chalk talk, you want to prep both electronic and board versions, so literally where you draw on the board. But nowadays, basically the goal of the chalk talk is to present your research statement in broad terms. So think Shark Tank. You wrote your research statement. So now it's your opportunity to present your research statement and get asked questions about it. But then with COVID-19, I had to adapt my chalk talk a little bit. So I ended up doing 2 on-site interviews remotely. And for one of those, I ended up drawing my sketches on a tablet or I scanned them in from a piece of paper. And then I organized them into a simple presentation on PowerPoint. So it kind of simulated me drawing for them. And that was a pretty effective way to do that. But again, work with your search committee and establish expectations before you do your presentations. Meals, really try to order easy to eat meals. Don't order sandwiches or things that you touch with your hands because you're wearing a suit and things can get messy. Dinners were the hardest part for me because it was at the end of a very long day and the first thing that I wanted to do was go to my hotel room and sleep. But really it's just a matter of powering through and staying engaged. But with COVID-19, the 2 interviews that I did remotely, there was no dinner. So it was kind of just nice signing off at 5 p.m. and then just kind of staying at home, right? And then at the end, you want to send thank you emails to everybody you interacted with, faculty, staff, organizers, students, et cetera, like everybody. It's so critical to send that thank you email. And don't expect an answer from anyone, and that's okay. But it's really important to submit those thank you emails, I'd say within 24 to 48 hours after your interview. Second visits, this is where things got really tough for me because of COVID-19. So second visits generally happen in the winter and spring, but obviously with COVID-19 shutting everything down in March, I never, or at least most of my second visits were canceled. It was really disappointing to make this insanely huge decision blind. And I can commiserate with everyone in the audience that's trying to go on the market this year, because it will be blind for most everybody, and it's very difficult. But and I can like I'd be happy to open up question and answers and talk about all of that. But I'm mostly just sharing my experience with second visits, so you can kind of get an idea of how to navigate this whole thing. So I ended up with 9 offers, um, and but you generally only want to go on second visits for your top 3 to 5 places. It's really important to start declining other offers so search committees can move on with other candidates. So that's an important part of the etiquette in all of this, is that you don't want to hold on to offers for as long as possible until you sign. It's really important to identify within the options that you already have, identify your top 3 to 5, and pursue second visits with those and decline the others. Some unique things that happened to me: I lost 4 offers because of COVID-19. They offered me the position, we were negotiating, but then once things started closing down and universities evaluated their financial situations, they started imposing hiring freezes. So I lost 4 offers because of that. So ultimately, based on all of the uncertainty, I was like, well, I'm going on all my second visits. So I did 5 second visits, and everything was, so one second visit was in person. So I got to basically request to meet with whoever I wanted. I basically targeted people that I didn't get a chance to meet with on my first interview, potentially collaborators outside of the department, institute directors, facility managers. This is an opportunity to get lab space tours. Also an opportunity for me to rent a car and explore the city, see if I could actually live there. A realtor takes you out to see houses, and it's an opportunity to bring your family. I have no idea what second visits are going to be like post-COVID. I hope that people will be able to go to see wherever they'll be in person. But my 4 other second visits were remote, which is what might happen to candidates this cycle as well. And I basically just requested to meet with whoever I wanted. I got videos of my lab spaces, potential lab spaces, photos, those kind of things. And I did have remote meetings with realtors to get a sense of the housing markets and those kind of things. So you have to figure out what's most important to you, and departments will be accommodating with the remote visits. Then very quickly, negotiating. So once you get an offer, you submit a budget. And this is a budget where you generate line items for all of your major expenses. Thinking about your capital equipment purchases, lab consumables, personnel, your summer months, space needs, et cetera. And you quite literally want to list everything that you can envision yourself using for your future research lab. Then an offer letter generally has a start date, your salary, a total startup budget. For bioengineering, it generally was 1 million to 1.5 million. But there's different flavors of money. So sometimes a 1.5 million budget might not be the best because you have to spend it within 2 years. Whereas maybe a $1.25 million budget is better because you can spend it in 5 years, right? So it's just like, it just kind of depends on how you want to budget your time, or how you want to spend the money ultimately. Your offer letter talks about your teaching commitments, lab space, you think about your square footage, etc. Everything is negotiable. The only thing that I was not successful in negotiating was salary, and this was largely due to COVID-19 effects. And try to reach out to your advisors and grants officers for help. They were hugely important in helping me navigate what I could and what I could not negotiate. And then the time comes where you sign and celebrate. So I signed with UC San Diego in the bioengineering department. It was my top choice all along, and I could not have been happier or feel more lucky that I ended up going to the institution that I wanted to. And I ended up celebrating with my parents in quarantine. So I mentioned that they live in Colorado Springs, so we got to celebrate the special moment together. And I would have loved to have a big party, but that's just not possible now. So maybe I'll have a party when I actually move out to San Diego. But just very quickly, some final comments before I open everything up to question and answer. So again, the entire process took 9 to 11 months. So from first submitted application to signed offer. This timeline might be shorter or longer for others. It just really depends. So another way to stay motivated through this process is thinking that this entire thing is a PR stunt. Academics need to get to know you, and trying to go on as many interviews as possible was hugely beneficial. So that's kind of one of the advantages of applying to lots of places and getting as many interviews as you can, because at least you get to spread what kind of research you want to do and spread your brand out there, right? Like, I think that's hugely important. And so yeah, it was exhausting going on all these interviews, and I felt really thankful. But this is what really kept me motivated, is that I knew that this was the long-term game, and that you had to think like, well, if this interview doesn't result in a job, at least I got to meet all these wonderful faculty. I kept a journal, and I wrote down all my memories after a visit. It's actually kind of fun looking back and like seeing all my highs and lows through the process. With that, you want to really be forgiving with yourself. I messed up tons during the process. I felt sometimes I knew what I was doing and then that didn't work. So you just have to be adaptable and really be forgiving with yourself, that like you might not get it perfect every time. There are some phone interviews that went amazingly well, some phone interviews that just did not. So it's just like, and just be forgiving yourself with that, and just know that you're worthy of this line of work. Some departments will already, as I was mentioning to you, some departments will have already made up their minds about candidates. So really don't go into an interview with any expectations. Really just make it about meeting people and sharing your research, and that will keep you motivated. The system is set up for single candidates without dependents, and it's really unfair. I think that departments are doing better with family accommodations and partner accommodations, but I mean, if I had kids, I would never be able to do weekly travel sessions, right? Like, it's just not fair to candidates with families. So it's just, there's so many issues to think about with the search process. But in any case, kind of be prepared for that. But really just say, like, if a department doesn't accommodate your needs, they don't deserve you, and you should move on. And really just, it's trying to stay positive. The process is so tough, but really no one can take away that moment of you just like signing that paper and knowing exactly where you're going. And it's just so exciting and so thrilling that you get to do this for your career. So I hope that this kind of whirlwind of tips kind of helped demystify a lot of things, or maybe it mystified things even more, I don't know. But hopefully everyone got a kind of idea of what how the process works, right? So really, I do wish everyone the best of luck. This is a really trying process, but at the end of it all, it's so worth it, because I'm just so excited to be a professor and start my new lab. And please feel free to reach out to me with any questions as we sign off. But I'm more than willing to stay online to answer people's questions now that we have lots of time. So we'll keep this informal, and I welcome anybody's questions.
Great. Thank you, Brian. That was a really great presentation with an awful lot of information. We've had one question to ask about sharing your slides. I forgot to mention at the beginning that this is being recorded, and it will go up on the PAC website on our YouTube channel. So we'll make sure that we distribute that on Twitter and get Brian to tweet it out as well, so everyone can see the slides. But yeah, if we can find a platform to put your slides as well, or contact Brian for the slides, I'm sure he'll be happy to share those.
Sure thing. I'd be more than happy to.
Cool. Everyone so far is saying that your talk was amazing.
Oh, let's see. So, oh, I can see the chat now. Okay, great.
Yeah, it's really...
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, you guys are more than welcome.
Is anyone, one person has raised their hand. So Anthony, do you want to go ahead and ask a question if you had one?
Yes.
Oh, I can't hear you very well, Anthony. Sorry.
Uh-oh. I might have to put it in the chat then.
Oh, that's way better. I can hear you.
Oh, you can. Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate your presentation and everything you've presented today. The question that I had, actually, it's two questions. First one is regarding meetings with realtors at the second visits. Is that something that's an expectation, or is that something that you had to request to begin with?
So I requested, and this was kind of just talking to other assistant professors that that I had gotten to know, and they're like, "Oh, you should see if you can meet with a realtor." And I was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." So you would just reach out to maybe professors in your department or in that department and say like, "Hey, do you have a realtor?" And that was my experience. Rob Knight actually sent me his realtor, so that was kind of cool. So yeah, I think that's generally the expectation. That's what happened when I did my on-site second visit. A realtor took me around to different neighborhoods and I got to see houses and stuff. So that was exciting too. The department is like rolling out the red carpet for you on the second visit. Like they want to recruit you at that point. So they will do anything within their means to get you there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my second question is, with regards to the budget that you proposed, was there something that kind of indicates whether the budget that you're proposing is unreasonable for the university? I guess what's some guidelines for you to understand what's reasonable, what's the average that, you know, other candidates usually propose?
Sure thing. My strategy was I'm going to outline everything that I could possibly need. Even if it's like $1 million microscope, I'm going to put it on there. Next, you want to filter your list. So like, let's say your capital equipment, right? Like, let's say I have 10 pieces of equipment that I need, but 3 of them are over $1 million. So like, that's not going to happen, right? So you want to list them because you need to tell your department, I need access to these pieces of equipment if you're going to recruit me. So it's important to have it in there. But so you basically just like have 2 sections of capital equipment that you want in your lab and that will be within reason of that 1 to 1.5 million. But then you are going to have other pieces of equipment that are way too expensive for you to afford as an assistant professor. So you have to put those in your list so that the department knows that you need access to them. But then you say like, that's something that I don't need, right? So you're gonna have 2 totals. One total is gonna, like I had a $2.6 million budget, but ultimately I knew that's not gonna happen. So really you wanna set your kind of price point at the $1 to $1.5 million range. And of course, this is very department specific. And it might be very different for COVID. I have no idea what startup packages will look like post-COVID, but that was my strategy, was to try to set like your dream lab and then filter through and say like, these are my most important things that I need to be successful, right?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Cool. So we've got a couple of questions on the chat. Aaron asks, did you ever seek information from departments, chairs about what made your application successful or not successful?
No. If I got positive, so okay, I never sought out the information, but departments and professors would tell me like why they thought that I would be a really great fit. When I got rejected, so I'll share a story about rejection. So I had interviewed at Berkeley in the bioengineering department, and another one of my close friends, Durfa Gale, she won the search and she's amazing. And one of the reasons why was because Berkeley last year was searching for an immunoengineer. And Durfa Gale was an immunoengineer. She fit the bill perfectly. And myself, I was more focused in cardiovascular medicine and translational medicine and biomaterials, right? So I think it's a lot of it is like do you fit the job call, right? Like I might have some super cool research, but then they're probably going to choose another candidate that is more suited for what the department needs at that point. So at that stage, I was like, well, awesome. I'm glad that Berkeley found the candidate for them, right? Like, so I did get that feedback. I got a phone call from the search chair and they're like, we tried everything to get a position for you. It's just like, we were only slotted one job this year. So yeah, I did get some information about rejections. So departments will tell you, but some departments are just radio silent. And you just kind of prep yourself for that also. So yeah, I think that's the best answer I can give for that question.
Great. We do have one question to ask. One question asks, did you ever apply for positions in Europe? Which I believe is no.
No. So, I mean, one of the major reasons was because I felt like, so I was tied to my K-99. So I received this wonderful transition award from the NIH. And that, I think so the K-99 is really for US universities. So that kind of tied me to the US, but I never really considered universities outside the US.
Great. And what drew you to San Diego?
That's a great question. So lots of reasons. UCSD, the bioengineering department is, I think, arguably like the best department. I think it was ranked #1 in NRCs. So like, I'm going to get amazing graduate students. I'm going to get amazing resources. Let's see. On the personal level, like, again, I despise winter. So moving to a place that has permanent summer is ideal for me. Like it's going to stay reasonably close to family. Like, so there's so many reasons, but really UCSD is like the perfect place for me to launch my research program. And that's like ultimately what drove me to choosing UCSD.
Great. Yeah, I remember having lots of conversations with you about how cold some places are. So,
yeah.
I've just got one other question about the talk in your first interview. Do you have any suggestions on how to frame the content of the seminar talk during the first interview? Is it important to customize the talk for each interview?
Okay, so I'm gonna assume that by first interview they mean remote interview. So I'll say that for your remote interview, you don't generally give seminars. The remote interview is basically just a Q&A session for them to get to know you and to get to know what you are about. And usually there's no slides. So you basically just say like, this is what my research program is about. Excuse me, this is what my research program is about. So yes, like, I think the content of your research program is, this is who I am and what my research will be. But what ends up being customized is the collaborations that you foresee, the institutional opportunities that you foresee, and the geographical opportunities that you foresee, right? So in that sense, that part of the answer is customized, but really your research statement stays the same, right? Like your initial research pitch of what you want to do, that doesn't change as a function of university. So hopefully that kind of helps clarify what the remote interview will be like. I don't know if there are other questions.
That sounds about it from the chat. If anyone has any questions who are online, feel free to shout out.
Again, I'm willing to stay on if people want to have a more informal one-on-one. I book time through 3:30, so I can stay for another half hour if you guys want. So. Oh, I'm getting some congrats. So thanks. I know Stanley. Thanks, Stanley. It's nice. So Aaron submitted another question. Going off your previous answer, did you apply to positions that didn't fit your expertise? That's a good question. Yes, I did. And I did not get callbacks for those positions. So I applied to Duke Bioengineering, for example, and Duke Bioengineering was looking for artificial intelligence, and I clearly do not do that. So I never got a callback or anything. And I do know that they eventually made a hire, so someone that is in AI. So I think you could save yourself a lot of time by not submitting applications that are completely outside your wheelhouse. Um, I think like I got advice saying like, oh, you should just submit, like don't matter, like submit. But really it's about like, I mean, like, for example, Berkeley, like I'm kind of immunoengineering. So I submitted and was almost successful. Like I was second choice. But I think that they would have maybe given me the position if the other candidate rejected, right? Um, but for example, like Duke, I know Rice was also looking for artificial intelligence and I submitted there and got rejected. So it's like, I think that you could save yourself a lot of time by not submitting applications to uh, jobs that are outside of your expertise. I'll say that.
Okay, and one question that's just come up is, well, actually two questions we've now had. How related was your proposed research program to your postdoctoral work? Did you have to figure out what from your postdoctoral research work was yours to continue into your new position?
Yes, and this is absolutely critical. You will be asked how you will distinguish yourself between your postdoctoral advisor and your graduate advisor. That being said, like I think the easiest way to do this is you have, so you have your PhD and your postdoc experience, right? And you learned critical skills. Like maybe you learned how to design a biomaterial, or maybe you learned a cool technique, or maybe you learned this. Like what I did was I had the toolbox that I learned from my PhD and postdoc, but I made sure that the biological questions I was answering were completely different from the research interests of my postdoc and PhD advisor. And that was enough to suggest that I have the skills to pursue these research questions, and they will be different enough from what my mentors are doing right now. So yeah, I think that that's the best way I can answer that question. And like I can bounce ideas off of you and like trying to figure out like how to define like what research is yours. But really it's like if you just design research projects that are completely different from your postdoc advisor, that will make you more successful.
Yeah, I think that's a common question that a lot of people struggle with sometimes with
It's
the
tough.
skill sets.
I think like you don't want to like if I propose something crazy like, oh, I want to explore the microbiome. Like I have zero experience in microbiome research. It's something that I'm interested in, but if I made my entire proposal about microbiome research without knowing any of the tools or how to do it, like
Yeah.
it just doesn't make sense.
Yes, no, that's very true. One quick question about visas. It's obviously not your case, but wonder if you have any advice on the universities to sponsor visas for international candidates.
Ooh, this is so Diego asked this question. I see that now.
Yeah.
Diego, please feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in touch with my friend Anna. Anna is a green card holder. I know that she went through these issues. Unfortunately, I'm just not as familiar with these processes. I do think that universities sponsor visas, but I think if I look back at my offer letters, I think there was some stipulation, like one university said explicitly in the offer letter, we cannot use startup funds to support visas. So I kind of just ignored that because that didn't apply to me. But I do think that some international candidates end up negotiating that as part of their package. So again, I'm happy to connect you with some people that I know went through this and would better be able to answer that question.
Great. Yes, Brian is very well connected, so it's also a benefit. Next question, we have just a few more. Have you contacted the search committee before you submitted applications? And if so, what was your reason for contacting?
So I did not make cold calls to search committees. So my strategy was contacting professors in the department that I know personally. So that's why it's so important to network, right? And having that established network was really immensely helpful for me. So just for example, UCSD, I reached out to like a close friend in that department, and she told me that, oh yes, there's a position opening up soon. And then I was like, that's great. So like that was helpful. You know, it's good to build those connections so that other folks can kind of say like, oh, this person's interested in our position and those kind of things, you know? So to be honest, I never contacted the search committee before I submitted. I don't think that that's particularly helpful. I do think it's important to submit emails to folks that are not on the search committees, and then maybe they'll put you in touch with the search committee, you know? So like, then again, like if you personally know that person on the search committee, then sure, reach out to them. I think that makes total sense.
And maybe we should make this our last question, but if people also have other questions, Brian's contact details are on the screen at the moment. But when did you decide you were ready to go on the job market?
Oh, this is such a tough question.
Yeah, I think this is a good question, I'm sure, for a lot of people who are wondering when, or we've had a couple of people who are PhD students. It's a great thing to get started early.
Yeah, so this is what worked for me. And again, there's like, this process works so differently for everybody, and there's no one size fits all. I told myself, so, okay, let me preface this by saying, so there's this like mentality that people are like, oh, just go on the market and see how you do. I was always so skeptical of that mentality because going on the market is hard. It takes so much time. And if I told myself, if I went on the market, invested all of that time and ended up not getting a position and having to repeat the process the next year, I was like, no. I told myself, I am not going on the market until I make absolutely sure that my CV is as perfect as it can be within my control to press the button and get started. And like, for example, in 2018, I was submitting my K application and people were like, are you going on the market? Are you going on the market? And I was like, no, I want to go on the market when I have a K award in hand and when I have my big postdoc paper published. And I waited. And I think that that was honestly the best decision, because in 2019, I had my K, I had my paper for my postdoc, and that got me tons of attention. And I think that other candidates maybe rush the process, and like it's like I heard the analogy of being an avocado. You don't want to be too ripe, but you don't want to be underripe. Like you want to be just right. Because if I had waited maybe this year to go on the market, I would have been way too ripe, right? Like it would have not made sense. You know, like you really want to try to time it in the best way. And again, there are some things that are out of your control and might not let you do that. But I think that by acknowledging that, yes, you do need papers and yes, you do need funding to be more competitive, I told myself to be as competitive as possible, I will wait to go on the market until I have those things in hand and then be able to put my best foot forward. So that was my strategy. Again, everyone goes through different experiences. And I think that the way that you learn how you make this decision for yourself is just by listening to other people and listening to their experiences. And if that resonates with you, then maybe that's the better, maybe it's better for you to go earlier than later. So again, it's all candidate specific.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for sharing all your knowledge and demystifying this whole process. I hope it's been really helpful to everyone. And I put in the chat the link to where this recording will be uploaded. So look out for that. We'll also post it when we do that, and the slides as well. If you have any ideas that you would like to see this postdoctoral seminar give, or if you would like to give a seminar, please feel free to reach out. The PAC website has a form that you can fill out if you are willing to do a seminar, or if you would like a seminar on a certain subject. So please keep in touch, and good luck to anyone that is going on the market this year.
All right, good luck and stay in touch, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.